Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill. This is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I have a great story today. It really is a story that should be made into a movie. It's an amazing story. Have you ever wondered how the saints were able to travel across the Indian territories and were generally unmolested by the Indians in comparison to other groups of immigrants? The story I'm going to share today fills in the gaps of this period of history. I've climbed a lot of mountains in my life. You sometimes just become exhausted. You think, I can't go any further. And in those moments, I usually pick a spot up ahead of me and say, I'll hike till I get to that rock or that tree. And then I push through my fatigue. And when I get to that declared goal, I find I'm able to actually go further. And so I push myself a little further. I think all of us establish lines in the sands of time and say, that's as far as I can go, Lord. And the Lord always has a way of pushing us beyond that mark. This story takes place when tens of thousands of the saints had escaped the mobs and were fleeing into the unknown. The church leaders had been staggered by the momentous responsibility, with no understanding of where they were really going or what they would encounter, and tens of thousands of homeless saints to take with them on a journey that they really knew nothing about. They knew they were going to go through the Indian territories and over the Rocky Mountains, and really knew nothing else. At the time, it was very dangerous to travel through the Indian territories. William Carter Staines was a man that was largely responsible as an emissary to the Indians without any knowledge of it before he accepted the call. Brigham Young's nephew, John R. Young, wrote in 1847, William C. Staines was a 28-year-old Englishman, small in body and so deformed as to almost be a cripple. Yet because of this grand soul's lofty obedience, he penetrated the Indian tribes as far as the Sioux, and by his sacrifices and force of character, he won their friendship and made impressions that opened the way for our people to pass through their lands in peace. William Staines was a large contributor to that feeling of peace between the saints and the Indians. A few days after the Mormon battalion had left for Fort Leavenworth, the leaders of the church met in Council Bluffs and decided that they needed to send an expedition over the mountains immediately. It was late in the year, and they determined to call Bishop George Miller. His company was about to arrive. He had served in the first presiding bishopric in the church and was actually the second bishop ever set apart by Joseph Smith himself. William Carter Staines had traveled with Bishop Miller and his family, but had been extremely sick for 2 months. He'd had extreme fever. Just before they got to Council Bluffs, the fever broke. But his legs and his trunk began to break out in 1-inch deep, huge, gaping wounds, and was extremely painful for him. When they arrived in Council Bluffs, 4 of their teamsters were redirected to travel with the battalion, and several more of their able-bodied men were sent with them. Bishop Miller was scrambling to answer the call to take an expeditionary group across the mountains. As he tried to organize the company, he asked William Staines if he would become a teamster and drive one of the heavy wagons. But with the open wounds on his legs and his trunk, it would be an extremely painful call to heed. And yet Brother Staines accepted the call. Here they were just facing winter. They didn't know what type of Indians they were going to meet. They didn't know what kind of terrain they were going to face. They didn't know how they would get supplies. And as they worried about all this, Bishop Miller made a prophecy before they left. He said, "Let me say, I promise you all this day in the name of the Lord, that you shall see the time while upon this journey, that you shall have more grain than you can load in your wagons. You will leave many bushels behind you to waste upon the ground." And with that reassurance, Bishop Miller and his company began their journey. It was a bumpy road that was passable for a team and wagon. It was extremely painful for Brother Staines as he bounced on the buckboard of that heavy wagon. But each day he would clean his wounds before and after the journey, and they slowly began to heal. They were traveling on a wagon trail that led towards a Pawnee village, an outpost. And as they were traveling, all of a sudden they were met by a group of white men that were fleeing to the east, and it was the Indian agent and the men that had been working with them. And they had been trying to teach the Indians how to build houses, fence in land, and sow the fields with grain. And the Pawnee Indians had become exasperated and rebelled and killed 2 of the men. So these men were fleeing, but as they met this company of Mormons going towards their outpost, some of the men decided that they would travel with them and try to retrieve some of the property that they had left. When they arrived, they found the Pawnee had fled. They were worried that the U.S. troops might attack them for killing white men. They dug a huge hole in the ground and buried all of the property that they had come to retrieve, and then they covered it with soil and built a huge fire on top of it to disguise the digging. And then these men gave them all the crops that were there. And the buildings had grains, barley and wheat and oats that had already been threshed, and they just gave all these to the saints. The saints stayed there a few days, and then they received a letter from Brigham Young. The letter directed them not to cross the Rocky Mountains so late in the season, but to winter on Grand Island, which was in the Platte River, but it was owned by the Pawnee Indians. It was their land, and they were in a grumpy mood, and it was kind of a terrifying proposition to winter on Pawnee property. About that same time, a group of Ponca chiefs came into the outpost and met these LDS people. And as they spoke, they found that they were planning to winter on Pawnee ground. And they said, "Why don't you come to our village? We have plenty of timber, and we have lots of feed and shelter for your animals." A day or 2 after this invitation, a group of 30 more LDS men with their families arrived. So the company had grown substantially in number. And they held a council and decided that the best thing for them to do, even though Brigham Young had directed them differently, they decided to go with the Ponca Indians. After they made this decision, the following day they loaded their wagons with all of the grain and potatoes they could possibly carry. And then in fulfillment of Bishop Miller's prophecy, they had to leave produce and grain laying on the ground to rot. They were leaving the last outpost of civilization. And on the 4th day, as they were traveling, a chief came to them saying that his party had killed 3 buffaloes. So Bishop Miller told the group, "Let's stop here by this stream." And then that night, they feasted on buffalo meat. And this was the first meat that they had had in 10 weeks. They killed many more buffalo as they traveled, and on the 11th day, they were within a couple of miles of the Ponca Indian village. They were soon visited by the entire Ponca nation. Most of them had never seen an ox or a white man. The chief called a council of all the braves, and he explained to them that he had invited the LDS people to winter on their property. The council all agreed that the LDS company could stay on their land that winter. The next day, the whole village turned out to trade with them. They traded for flour and sugar and coffee and gave moccasins and buckskins and buffalo robes. The next morning, when the saints got up and realized that everyone seemed to be missing axes and pans and knives and all kinds of implements. And when the chief heard of this, he commanded all of the Indians to return the property they had stolen. A tenth of what was taken was returned. So the Indians had 2 men at all times guard the LDS community and keep the Poncas from coming to visit. The remainder of this story I'm going to tell in the words of William Staines. About the 1st of October, the Ponca chief came to Bishop Miller and told him that they were going to leave and go to their hunting ground for the winter. And he asked if a few of our young men, and he mentioned me specifically, stating that I was good and kind to his people. I had my cobbling tools and had mended pouches and moccasins for the Indians. Bishop Miller said, calling me by name, I would like you to go with them. The chiefs and the braves have taken quite a liking to you, and I feel as though you will be doing much good going on this journey. A peculiar feeling came over me as he was speaking, and I was led to say, Bishop Miller, if you feel I can accomplish good by going with these people, I will go. I have no relatives in camp to mourn if I'm lost. My weak body can be spared better than the more able-bodied. There and then he appointed me to go, and blessed me in the name of the Lord, saying that I should do much good, adding that I had great faith in the God of Israel, and that he would direct me in a marvelous manner. By this time, the sores on my legs were beginning to heal. It had been extremely painful, bouncing on the buckboard of the wagon throughout the journey, so the thought of walking seemed like a good alternative to me. The next morning we started. Our company consisted of me, Brother Kay, and Brother Bainbridge, and the entire Ponca Nation, which was about 2,000 souls. 2 hours before the Indians left, the chief came to Bishop Miller to smoke the pipe of peace with him. When the Poncas finished their smoke ceremony with Bishop Miller, they shook hands with their white friends, jumped in their saddles, and led the huge procession away. In front were the chiefs and some of the braves on horseback. Next came the squaws, leading horses packed with their lodges and supplies. Next came the old men and old women, with their lodges drawn by dogs with poles strapped to their backs. And among these were the young men and young women, all on foot. And the young men all carried a bow and arrow, and as they walked, they had a lot of fun shooting arrows at small targets, rabbits, birds, anything probably that moved. And when they got to camp, the young people spent a lot of time shooting at targets. Any of the mothers that had small babies strapped them to a board and carried them on their backs. And so this tribe of 2,000 people began to make their journey towards their winter quarters, accompanied by 3 white men. The Poncas called the white men Moritongar. Mori means knife, and Tongar means long, because the first white people that the Indians had seen all carried swords, and to them they looked like long knives. The Poncas also gave William the name Waddyshipper, which means strike flint for fire. Each day at daybreak, the chief would notify the camp to prepare to leave. And no sooner was the word given than everyone began to pack up, and within an hour they were on the move. Another chief would give orders for all those who had hunting horses to prepare for a hunt, and later they would meet the hunters who had killed buffaloes to feed the 2,000 hungry souls in the Ponca Nation. And soon the whole camp was set back up. Lodges were up, fires were going. He said the first night he ate over 2 pounds of meat, and that it was strange not to have anything to eat but meat. They had no bread and no potatoes. He did say that they had gone 10 weeks on their journey with no meat to eat, only breadstuffs. And given the option between only bread or only meat, he said after having experienced eating just meat, that was his preference because it seemed to afford his body more energy and strength. The country they were traveling in was very rough, and it was almost impassable for wagons. And soon Brother Kay and Brother Bainbridge decided to leave. Brother Staines said, "I must confess, I felt a little homesick when they left. I knelt in a ravine and prayed to the Lord for strength and more faith to accomplish the work before me." He went into the chief's lodge. Two young Indian girls came in and asked Brother Staines for his comb. The one girl motioned to him to braid her hair like they had seen the white women's hair. Brother Staines said he blushed a little at the thought, and when he did, the girls giggled, and then he did his very best to do a braid, when the other young girl did a much better job than he had done and undid his work and redid the braids on both sides of her friend's head, and then they changed places. And the next morning, many of the young girls in the Ponca Nation were wearing braids. Brother Staines started his journey with an old pair of shoes, and within 2 weeks they were just about done. And one of the chiefs presented him with a pair of moccasins they had made for his feet. And they lasted quite a while, but they began to show wear. And one day he was walking with one of the chief's sons, and the young man looked down, and he could see Brother Staines' toe sticking through the moccasins. He immediately took off his brand new moccasins and handed him to Brother Staines, and the young man was thrilled to make the trade, that he could give Brother Staines his moccasins. Brother Staines said that each tribe's moccasins were shaped differently, and therefore they could recognize the footprint of different tribes. And he said their arrows were also very distinctive. He said the Indians recognized these signs as readily as we would recognize the different European flags. The chiefs teach their young men to be peaceful when others wish peace, and only fight when others are determined to fight. He said they had perfect order in their village. Each day, 4 Indians were appointed to act as police, and they would blacken their faces, and they would keep complete order in the camp that day. Brother Staines said that he had previously been told that Indians were barbaric in character and habits. He said this could be the case with some tribes, but in the Poncas, he said he never saw anything in the 6 months he spent there that would make a woman blush. He said he had always looked upon the Indians as the enemy of the white men, believing that they would rob and kill him. However, the Poncas treated him with complete kindness. He said, "I always lived in the best lodge of the village. I had the best seat of their councils. I had the best food the nation had to offer, and was treated by chiefs, soldiers, braves, and all people as I was their king. They preferred to be friendly to white men if they would treat them right." He said the most exciting thing he ever saw in his life was a huge buffalo hunt, a herd of over 400 buffaloes. The Ponca chief, with 50 of his braves on horseback, slowly approached from behind the herd and were within a few yards of the herd when they noticed the Indians coming and took off. And the chief began to gallop, and he picked out the fattest buffalo in the herd and shot him, and all the other Indians followed behind him. And soon the herd was scattered across the plains, and there were 50 Indians chasing the buffaloes. After the hunt, the old men and women come in, and they skin the buffaloes and take as much meat as they can carry. But the buffalo skins belong to those who shot them. Brother Staines said within a few months he began to understand their language quite well, and he was able to converse with them. Sitting in the evenings, the chiefs would ask him about their people. They wondered where they were going and why they were going so far from their white brothers. Brother Staines explained to them the principles of the gospel. He told them how Joseph and Hiram had been martyred and their people had been driven out of their homes. He also told them about the Book of Mormon, and they took great interest in the Book of Mormon and asked him about the Book of Mormon many, many times. Brother Staines went several months only eating meat, And as winter set in, he found that a kind of scurvy was breaking out on his right side, and his leg began to swell. And he feared that if the scurvy continued to get worse, he'd not be able to walk when the Indians traveled from one camp to another as they migrated through their winter hunting grounds. And so he pled with the Lord to bless him. He said that by the time he got to camp, his legs were so sore and his knees so swollen that he could hardly walk across the lodge. But he'd pray and ask the Lord for his help. And by the time they had to travel again, his legs were able to travel. They remained in one camp in the middle of the winter for quite some time. And he said at that point he became a mass of boils. And they went from his face down to his ankle on his right side. And he said the pain was severe and the itching was terrible. He said the boils would heal for a short time, and then they would return and break out. And he became weaker and more faint. It was the last of November, so the weather was cold. He said, notwithstanding these afflictions, he felt blessed of the Lord and was not discouraged. And a short distance from their camp, there was a 2-acre plum patch with a clearing in the middle. And he said this became his prayer room. And he asked the Lord to sanctify it. He said when he retired there for prayer, he felt the Lord was with him. On Christmas Day, he began to experience severe pain. The swelling had gone from his knees up into his body. He suffered terribly for several days, and he began to feel like he would die, and he would die soon. And finally he thought, I have enough energy. I can make it over to my prayer room in the plum patch. This will be the last time I can. I will die within the next day. And he was quite worried. He said the Ponca Indians buried their people in a very shallow grave, and the ground was so frozen that it would be very difficult for them to put enough material over him to keep the many wolves surrounding the camp from tearing his body apart after he was buried. So he says as he walked towards his prayer room with those horrible thoughts passing through his mind, he knelt down and prayed as he had never prayed before. He told the Lord of his fears, asking him to spare his life if he would. He said he wanted to see the saints again. But he said, if not, please protect my body so the wolves don't scatter me to the four winds. And then he rose and hobbled back to his lodge. When he got to the lodge, he got out his journal and he began to write. And then suddenly he began to write a message to himself from the Lord. He said, I was told that my prayers had been accepted and that I would live and return to the saints. I would travel much and I would see my sister again in the flesh. By the middle of February, the Poncas had migrated to a point where they were about 90 miles from the winter quarters of the saints and about 60 miles from where they were to meet a French trader. 2 of the Ponca braves were appointed to be runners, and just before they left, they asked if Brother Staines could go with them and possibly arrange some trade with the saints. So he agreed to go with them, and as he prepared to leave, he thanked the Ponca chiefs and the people for their gracious hospitality, and then he bid them farewell. And he says, before I left, the chief asked me for my Book of Mormon. He told me he would keep it as long as he lived, and his son would keep it after him. When I handed it to him, he thanked me and kissed the book, declaring it would be good medicine for his people. He said he felt as though his fathers were with him when he had my Book of Mormon. He said, I journeyed with the runners and met the traders. At sunrise the next morning, I bid them farewell and started my isolated journey with only a small piece of buffalo meat, a buffalo robe, and my rifle. The day was fine. I took the Indian trails and traveled about 30 miles. As the sun was going down, I looked around. I found a small ravine with tall trees and a lot of dry leaves under the trees. I made a fire. I roasted a little buffalo meat, and then I nestled down in those dry leaves and fell fast asleep. The next morning, he awoke, had a little more buffalo meat, and then he traveled another 30 miles that day. And then he said about noon on the last day, He was startled by the largest pack of wolves he had ever seen. He said they were running directly towards him, barking and snarling and howling. He was scared. He said it looked like they were coming to devour him. He said, I hurriedly prayed and asked the Lord to spare my life. When they were about 40 yards from me, I began to yell at them with all my might, knowing that if they attacked, I wouldn't last a minute. As I yelled, the whole pack stopped and looked curiously at me. I stared back at them sternly, and then suddenly they began to advance again. But they divided, and half of them passed on my left, and half of them passed on my right, each of them looking at me as they went by. As soon as they were past, I knelt down and thanked the Lord for preserving my life, and then continued on my journey. As the day was just closing, I was overjoyed to see 2 cattle yoked together on a hillside. I climbed that hill and saw wagons of the saints and fires. As I walked into camp, they said, Why, Brother Staines, is it really you? It is as if you were raised from the dead. The Indians told us you had died. Brother William Staines says, Thus ended my Indian mission, and although I suffered, it was the most interesting time in my life. Through my experiences, I became acquainted with how the Lord deals with his servants. I know that he hears and answers prayers at all times and under all circumstances. Before I close, let me say to everyone, never allow your faith to fail. Trust in the Lord and continue to pray to him. He will answer you. If not at first, pray again and again. Exercise faith, and I know you will be answered and blessed of the Lord. This great man became an emissary between the saints and the Indians, and that allowed them safe passage over the plains. William Staines reached Salt Lake Valley September 15th, 1847, and lived to see his sister many times. He was 36 when he married Lilas Thompson Lyon and began building an impressive home on the block north of today's Salt Palace. He was called to live the law of polygamy and later married Elizabeth Gill Turner and Priscilla Mogridge. In January 1851, he was appointed to take charge of the endowment rooms in the council house and continued to administer ordinances there until December of 1860, when he was called on a mission to England, and he served there from 1861 to 1863. He then served as the immigration agent for Utah in New York City from 1864 to 1865. He forwarded over 50,000 of the saints to Zion during that time. William Carter Staines died on August 3rd, 1881. He's a name that is not very well known to the Latter-day Saint people, and yet his willingness to do what the Lord asked him to do helped open the path for the saints to travel to the Great Basin. I hope you've enjoyed this story. I found it in a book that was published in 1880, and it's somewhat like translating from another language. The sentence structure and the wording they use is very different than how we speak today. I know that the Lord is aware of each of us. He knows our heartache. He knows our joys. He knows our desires. He knows what we need to experience on this earth so that we can return to him. If you find yourself wondering if the Lord knows you, I promise you, if you will ponder it in your heart and kneel down and humbly ask, God, are you there? Do you know me? Do you love me? If you will open your heart sincerely to that question, to the Almighty, I promise you that you will feel his love pour into your heart and into your mind, and you will know that you have a loving Heavenly Father. Thank you for watching today. You can subscribe here And if you enjoyed this story, you'd probably enjoy this one. You can watch all of Brother Merrill's stories right here. Thank you.